Pascal,
Hello.
imagine.
Hi, Jane. Do add me to the agenda 1 second.
Yeah, I'm still watching, so don't worry.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Jen. Hi, Martin.
Hi.
I think Kamil, yeah, Kamil is also coming. So I've commit.
Hey,
Eric.
Hey.
Almost through. Almost through.
wasn't sure if the savings time actually messed up the timing on the invite or not, but looks
Yeah,
like
it always messes up. I mean,
well, it messed up. It messed up for folks in Europe, but for us in US, I think it's the same. So
at the same time? Okay. Good
Yeah,
idea.
I think that's because we created it with a US time zone
well, it's
Yeah.
UTC, so
or UTC. Yeah. Not
yeah,
not sure how that affects it.
Yeah,
we
UTC
should.
without daylight savings, obviously, because it's always.
Yeah, that's what you'd think, but then. Oh,
I
so
mean,
it's the absolute. It's the same time.
I mean, look, we developers would have so much an easier time if people would just use UTC. I don't even care where the 0 point is. I don't mind waking up, going to sleep at 3 a.m. and waking up at 12 o'clock. I really don't care. Just
Do you remember? This is. I think this was like early 2000s or maybe
The
even
Swatch
before.
time.
Like Swatch, yeah, the internet time. They developed their own time keeping mechanism.
It didn't
I'm
work. So it flopped, but yeah, the idea was
yeah,
good.
I'm not even sure how it worked. Like I think it was decimal, but
Yeah, it was an absolute number. Had absolutely no resemblance to a normal time, but
I don't really mind having the 24-hour days. I quite like that, but I don't care when I wake up because my schedule is anyway messed up. So
so okay. This is I have one more. It's always like every commit, you have to resolve conflicts.
should I resolve it for you?
No, I'm already done. You interfere now.
I just force push to the repository.
Copy there. Oh, I don't care. Marcus resolved.
Next week is primary, just as
Yeah.
FY, so that we don't forget.
yeah, let's see what that means for the time zone because I think the US switch is off daylight
Whoa.
savings.
They didn't switch so far. Okay, that's why you guys are okay still.
Yeah,
it ends on Sunday.
They should just get rid of it. Like
they've been saying that for years and they haven't touched that.
yes,
Guys, kind of like
Yes.
yeah, let's do it, but
it's like
Yeah, the big problem is which time do you then adjust to?
I don't care. Just do any. Yeah, okay, let's start the meeting. Awesome.
For
So, hi everyone. Let's let me just remind you that by being here, we all agree to the GraphQL Spec Membership Agreement and to the GraphQL Foundation Code of Conduct. My name is Michael Stipe, and I'm the host today.
Shane Merrick
Shane.
from Apollo.
Coming from the guild.
I'm Derek from Apollo.
Martin from Apollo.
Carl from Chili Cream.
Okay, we don't have a fixed agenda, but we have a lot of validation things still ahead of us. So we can just pick one, because like the enum rule, do we have more to discuss on that, or is it, Pascal, that you first need to do some work on that still?
Yeah, I mean, I think what would be good is I will write the validation rule for next week so that we have it. But we have many of these validation rules, and I think it makes sense to merge them, and then maybe we can announce next week that validation is merged, and then we have like another month where we can still review it and things like this, but actually start working on the next steps, because we will anyway cycle back to validation. So if we just merge the things this week, and then we can like walk through the validation in the primary so everyone is up to speed.
There are also a couple of missing, right? There are a couple that Apollo Federation has more, for instance. We have to, some don't apply, but we have to go through and also see what is missing from what we have, right? Okay, so just for anybody, like here's the like lots of pull requests, and there are a lot of validation rules that we have here. Like this is the enum merging RFC, and Pascal's working still on that. We discussed a lot last week on that. There's also this guy here. We discussed that a while back, that for the beginning, we have a rule where lookups do not return lists. There's actually two parts to it. Like we have like this, the arguments here represent the key, right? And we do not return lists. So we don't have batching fields here, as they would just lead the user into problems. They would work in some cases, but as soon as you have requires, they wouldn't work. That's why we have a validation rule for this. I can also post them as I talk about these things.
Yeah, there's a to-do at the bottom that says explain the requires use case.
Yeah, as I said, I think when we merge the things, it's the right point to go through them and
Fix the to-dos. Fair enough.
I mean, the thing is that these pull requests are now open for so long, and interaction of it is a bit low. So I think it makes sense. We can walk through them now, but I think it really makes sense that we have that you have them all in one file, so you can review them much easier later on.
Yeah, then we have a chapter there.
Yep.
Just 1 second there. Is that this one is this guy here? Yeah. So before we merge these kinds, we can definitely fix. We should fix.
I think that even like if you merge it, if there is actually to-do, the to-do can be done in a follow-up PR. If we want to keep those simpler and go move forward. But
yes, because like it's easier to see, and then we have like PRs that do a change, like fix or explain a bit more about this use case and stuff like that. I did, by the way, the same thing with the source schema chapter here. So we have that now merged. So we don't have anymore this entity resolver directive, which was the original one, but we have now here a lot of things in. I also added here stuff about key. I think Martin had a couple of things still he wanted to clarify on this. But now we can do pull requests on that and just describe, okay, there's this detail missing. And I think, for instance, provides is very thin at the moment. Needs more text, but at least like these are the directives we have for version 1 at the moment in mind. And we can just
one of the things that is missing is sort of a set of consistent examples. And I know we talked about this, but I don't think we've landed on a common schema yet.
So what I use an example is mostly the product example because it's so widely used in federation examples. And it's easy to do something with that, like orders and stuff like that. It works out well.
So do we just want to stick to that and then add features as needed? So for the provides use case, for instance.
Yes, I would like, because like I think the themes of the web shop is good.
Yeah.
And also you can, if you, for instance, want to bring in things from Apollo, like for provides, then it's very easy to just adapt them because like you guys also use this example.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but by the way, just read through it and let's add to it. If we have other examples, we should adapt them. Like if there is like product price fits the theme, reviews is good. But if here is like an example that would not fit into this web shop, we should rewrite it. Okay. Yeah, but it looks mostly it's also products closing. It's a little bit different, but yeah, should fit. Okay, let's cycle back to this guy here. Okay, so everybody agrees on this one. Should we just merge it or?
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't. You want to fix the to-do first?
I want to, before we merge it, I want to, I mean, you opened, I think it was 50-50, right? So let's merge them one by one, but read the rule, see if it makes sense, if we spot something, and then merge it so that we just have the review of it. We can also do the peer review. I can do yours, you can do mine, then we can just...
Okay, let's do that. That's a good idea, Pascal. Okay, but general consensus is this one is good. Okay, the other lookup is adds validation rule. Lookup should have nullable return type. This was a bit of discussion. But like technically, you could also deal with errors. So this could also be a warning. But it's up to what others think. Like, do we want to deal with errors or do we want to strictly say, no, I think we also put here severity warning. Yeah, like, because this could be a warning.
For this we introduced the severity things. That might be something that we actually want to put into the other ones while we review. Because there will be a couple of warnings that we'll have in validation rules. In the validation and also in the composition later. I guess in the implementations, you probably also want to switch between warnings and errors.
I mean, there might be like treat warnings as errors setting or something, but the distinction is still useful, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. The list returned, that should never be the case, right? That should be an error.
Yeah.
This maybe there is a use case that folks wanna have it like that.
I mean, we still want to steer people towards sort of best practices. So
totally.
I see.
But we can actually deal with this with the list case. Like we would end up in situations where things compose, but you get into issues when you start query
Yeah.
planning,
Oh, yeah.
and that's what we're
Totally.
trying to avoid. So that's the distinction I think that we discussed
And
before.
and I think with the warnings, it's like compiler. You want to steer people with warnings to better build their schemas, but like it still could work out with the warnings. So we're going to add this to like the severity we add to every of these validation steps. And this is a bit different to the core spec because in the core spec, we only have errors, but here we will have both of these things. Okay. So, but in general, everybody agrees on this one as well. Like we can take it on. Okay. Again, yeah, if anybody wants to. Okay. It's good. Bang, this is nothing. Anti-object type validation rule. Quickly check what it's about. Ah, yeah, that's basically when an object type becomes empty because of inaccessible.
Yeah.
Like you compose, and after composition, you would end up with an empty object type. Then this would lead to an error. Like in this case, we also need to update the examples. So I make it a product.
And is it an error regardless of whether object type is being used in any public fields?
Would you remove it if it's not being used?
I'm not actually sure what our current behavior is with Apollo Federation, because I remember we discussed this exact use case, and then I think we may have landed on removing it. But Shane, do you or Derek?
Sorry,
can't remember.
What was the question?
I can't remember quickly off the top of my head, but I'm pulling up my composition testing repo real quick.
Great.
But I'm in favor of just not remembering the behavior. It could be a warning if it's not used, because then we could be a warning, be like, there's an object that's not used and it's empty. So it was trimmed from the graph, like to not have an empty object that would fail GraphQL validation, because we can't have that. But like we composition could remove it and say, hey, by the way, I removed this thing because it wasn't referenced.
Would this be a second rule, or do we want to have it in this rule? Like, do we look at empty objects that are not referenced, or?
I would say if we keep it, it's more, if we just remove it, it's more a composition rule rather than a validation rule.
Or do we anyway trim any objects that are not referenced?
But those are two different things, right? So if you have a reference to an object that's empty, that's clearly an error, right? That's a GraphQL spec error. But if you have unreferenced type, we should have a general rule that we just drop it from the super graph overall. So
yeah, that's a question, because you could, depending on when you run this rule, right? So you could, for instance, a first validation, a merge, trim, and then validate. Then this would never happen, right?
I mean, I'm not sure if we should trim unreferenced object.
No. I mean, that seems like very unexpected behavior.
There's a use case for exposing types that are not referenced, because you can start building components for these types in the UI, and everything works fine, even though the type is never referenced. I think that was even in the main work group of the specification.
Yes, we had discussions on that
about interfaces that have to have an implementation. If it's not
to relax that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to have an implementation, so you can actually use it to write your components. It's a bit difficult though, because what types do you even compose together? Because if you only have one internal if you only have one lookup in your subgraph and the other types or just from other components? Should you really expose them? Like,
Well, so Pascal, you just mentioned like for building like components, right? So like if you have a super graph of an empty type, clients won't be able to use because that's invalid GraphQL.
no,
No,
I mean,
but this
empty
is
type- empty
there's
type
two
is fine.
discussions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
empty type is fine. We shouldn't. So this validation rule, I'm not sure if it's actually. Yeah, it you see it has this is exposed. Yeah, maybe you have to. Michael, can you write a note that we have to verify that this type is actually referenced? Because if it's not referenced, I don't think that it should be an error. If you have
yeah.
a non-referenced type that just happens to have all fields inaccessible, we shouldn't care.
But should it be a warning in this case? Like say in this case, make the type inaccessible or something like this. Like,
I mean, what we ended up deciding is that there's no such thing, at least how I remember it, is that there's no such thing as marking a type as inaccessible. You mark fields in individual subgraphs as inaccessible, and when the type is empty, it gets removed.
Yeah.
I
but
think
there
that-
is like you have like what Shane posted is type Shane foo is inaccessible.
Well, you
Yeah.
can mark you can use inaccessible on a type definition, but that just means that all the fields
okay.
in that subgraph are marked as inaccessible.
That's
At least that's how I remember the discussion. Things may have changed since.
that's anyway something that we have to specify in the directive section. That's very
Yeah.
important. We have
Yeah.
to specify the behavior of the directives on types, because there's two different behaviors. So one is that you inherit it to all the fields, and one is that you actually want to annotate the entity. I believe shareable works the same as inaccessible, right? You can annotate it on it's just a shorthand for marking all the fields inaccessible.
I believe so. Yeah.
And the key definitely is not this. It's completely different. So that's something that that we definitely should know.
Okay, inaccessible, by the way, is still missing. Yeah, I think I have to somewhere on my to-do list. Yeah, so
one thing which I just wondered, can you I mean, unless we have something else that we want to define.
No, go ahead.
Do we have any rules, or have you ever discussed how we deal with interfaces and unions?
In what
in the
circumstances?
same in the same way, you mean? Like when interface are empty or in general?
No, I'm talking about this rule. I was talking about in general about validation, because I think as I was writing the enum validation rule, I was thinking about some of these problems apply to interfaces as well.
There is we have specific rules for interfaces as well. I don't know if I already raised pull requests for them, but like originally we had also interface validation. Like you could also end up in the same problem with interfaces.
But how do we merge the interfaces? I know there's this interface object stuff in
yeah, but don't worry about that.
No, I'm not worrying about that. I'm just worrying about what's the rule that we have for interfaces. Because do we take the union? Do we take the subset? I mean, union you cannot take, so you have to take the intersection of the interfaces.
No, it's
a union.
But the requirement is that if you need to have the implementations of that interface within that graph.
Yeah. So within that subgraph. So each subgraph can specify a subset of the fields of an interface and also implement those in the implementing types that it has defined locally.
Okay.
And yeah, and that's a necessity if you want an interface to be built up from multiple subgraphs.
Then we just take the union of the fields.
Yeah.
Good. That answers this question. Because then you can just rely on graphical validation.
Okay. Yeah, we still have to. You still have to define it in the composition.
Yeah, but that's composition.
Even if it's a GraphQL validation. Okay. So clean
I
up the
think-
examples.
If we remove the type or not is something that we can worry about in composition.
Yeah, so this is, yeah, if we remove the type, this would not be part of this rule.
Yeah, we can have a general rule that sort of removes empty types before actual composition, or before composition validation.
But do we want to do
Yeah, but you have to first merge, right? To figure out.
that?
Yeah,
So this would be after merge, remove empty types or something like this.
I think so. Yeah.
But do we really want to do that though? Because
Yeah.
that seems like
Well, because
Actually,
otherwise you end
actually-
up in a situation where the merged schema is invalid.
well, but that would, in my opinion, that well, so Shane posted examples, right? Surprisingly, one of them works, the other one doesn't. To me, that looks like a bug because they all should translate to the same thing. But if all the fields are inaccessible, to me, that should be a composition error, not a warning. It should actually error out the composition.
If this one fails, and yeah, the other one, which with
It's on the type.
Yeah.
That one actually succeeded, which to me, they all should be translated to the same thing. So that looks like a bug.
that's what I meant before. Like this on the type has a different effect in upon iteration, but
That's surprising, and I don't exactly understand the reasoning and sort of how we are treating these differently. Then maybe I'm missing something, or maybe it's
That looks like a bug to me.
it
but
might be a
that's-
bug. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think regardless of like this specific issue, as Michael just mentioned, like we actually have to merge first before we can sort of detect that the merge type is empty.
Yeah, we have these different validation stages, right? We have
Yeah.
which can run before the merge, and actually, as we found out, most of the validation rules actually can only run after the merge.
Yeah. But it's perfectly valid for a subgraph to mark a field as inaccessible, and like as a result, the type might become empty. But would that mean that like that change to that subgraph should fail composition? That
Oh, but
seems
there's a
surprising.
use case though, right? That there are use
Yep.
cases that you could use that with inaccessible keys, right? So
Yes,
technically,
this is.
all-
I was trying to get this to work. I can show my screen real quick and show how,
Yeah, wait,
how this is valid.
you can share.
So if you just did this, if you ignore this type, right? If I just tried composing with this here, this fails, right? Because there's not, even if it's
It's not an entity.
it's not an entity. Yeah, it's not an entity. Let me even just comment this out. Comment. Oop. Comment with only comment. There we go. Okay. Okay. So it doesn't exist in any other types. I'm only defining it here. It is being used, but since I'm compose, that works because I need to do this. Okay, this fails composition. There we go. All right, so we got an error. This fails because based off the error message, what actually is happening is it's just doing composition and then looking at the outputted API schema and seeing that, oh, there's a type where all its fields are marked as inaccessible and also not referenced or used. So like there's no clients using this and there's no subgraphs using this. So like no one's using it. So it's like we just say it's an error. So this is I think this is the debate we're having right now, which is like, if it's not being used anywhere, should it be a warning or error? But before we answer that, there is a valid use case for doing this.
But do we
which is-
treat entities and non-entities differently?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so if I mark this as an entity, and I can even make this as inaccessible here, right? And then I go to another subgraph and I uncomment this.
Well, but first, even without doing this, like how does this change composition? Like just
Okay.
like if it's just defined in that one
Sure.
subgraph, but it's an entity now. We still
Shane type
don't
Shane
allow
food.
it.
The
Yeah.
type is in the food and all its fields are inaccessible.
Okay, yeah.
So same thing, even if it's an entity. But then if I go here to another subgraph and I say, oh, I actually want to add a field exposed to clients. So I uncomment this.
Oh, but
Right, and
but
these
a
are-
two is but a two is accessible field. So
Yes,
two
it
has
is an
type of a
accessible field. Yes, it's an accessible field. So it is now, the type now does exist and
Yeah.
it passes, right? Even though I'm referencing this is never seen by any clients anywhere because it's only inaccessible. And I'm hiding, even the ID is inaccessible. It's only like
Which,
as a client, you only
But
say
it
Shane.
has at least one
yeah,
non-inaccessible
the
field.
API
So,
schema gets two, right? So it's still a valid object.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it will not become empty.
so does this mean we're never in a situation where we automatically remove a type when all its fields are inaccessible? Because I do remember we discussed that behavior, but
But is it can you go back? Because like in your schema, in this schema, you're still referencing Shane from above from the query type, right?
Yes, I am.
So if you make this inaccessible, this field,
or just remove it, yeah.
then
Let's see
it
what
should
happens.
be empty, and then it should be removed.
And then also remove it from the other
Yeah.
Yeah,
subgraph.
the other subgraph.
Just going to delete this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're comment it out, or yeah.
Okay, so it's only defined in this one subgraph. Yeah, it is now. Well, yes.
And what about the other one? No. Shane Fu is not used anywhere else, right? It's not exposed or
Correct. It's not.
Okay.
No. That was only defined here as a entity key or key entity extension.
yeah.
But how can you, like, this would lead, like, how could you get rid of it in like just with this?
So this is maybe the bug that Derek was talking about. This passes. It's current
That is
federation.
surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, is inaccessible in this case interpreted as on the type?
It might be.
One question. Can you go back? Can you add the field again to query? Is this field removed when you have it on the type as inaccessible? Is this the flag?
No, it's a reference inaccessible. Yeah.
Is referenced by a field that, yeah, which is.
Yeah, now it says the type Shane Fu is inaccessible. So it treats the type as inaccessible. Or at least it seems from the.
Yeah.
Can you go back to your to your dev team from Apollo Federation and just check what, like, if this is the intended behavior?
I'll check because it sounds weird. Yes, how it actually behaves.
I mean,
And get maybe the thoughts before we decide on something that.
I would love to have a simple directive handling strategy. Like because now we are in the situation that key is defined on the type and refers to the entity. Shareable is defined, if defined on a type, just inherits to the children, to the fields, and inaccessible is something in between. Now, there seems to be reasoning behind this, but it would be really nice if we, in the composite schema spec, just have, if possible, one, but if not, two behaviors.
There is a reasoning for intent. Okay, so intent actually is very important. So if I mark a type as inaccessible, yes, it's gonna make all the fields inaccessible, but it also makes sure that no one else in other subgraph can actually add types to it. Because that actually
can reference it.
So no one can actually.
It's
an entity, right? Entity. I have it. I lock it down, right? No, even if someone else tries to use it, has to be inaccessible. It cannot be there at all. So basically, it just locks it down. If you have it on the fields themselves, I can have another graph, as Shane showed, with the requires, right? And I can add new fields to it, which is perfectly fine. So this is like basically a intent
That makes a lot.
driven behavior, I guess.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what
Because
about
you can build up the type and then
Yeah.
at some point take into accessible away.
Yes.
what about if you think about this specific? If you think about it in the same way about shareable, is there any different effect other than just inheritance to the fields that shareable could have?
Not exactly, because if you make a type shareable, there's another graph that can have inaccessible fields or those private fields, right?
No, I mean just that's fine. That's fine. I'm just wondering, you know, if we can have one rule, like does shareable also need to have different semantics on if defined on the type, or is shareable?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a meaning for that, and so it might actually be. I think it was meant as a shorthand, maybe, so you don't have to specify shareable on individual fields. But
Right. I mean, we can define it
for clarity, like
Or-
it might actually be best to be explicit.
we could for theoretically we could for each directive define both locations and explain. If defined in this location, it's just a shorthand for inheritance for everything, and in inaccessible we just define it differently. It's just that we don't set up the rule that it's just inheritance. I would rather prefer to have for each directive location we actually describe the behavior, because then it's just a normal directive, and each location has a different behavior. One is on the field, this is shareable on the field, makes the field shareable, shareable on the type, makes all the fields shareable. If we define it like this, then there's only one behavior that we have, one directive application behavior, so to say.
Well, but it's still a
But-
little bit confusing because like directives on a type can mean like one of two behaviors. Like it can either be applied to the type, regardless of like which subgraph it's defined on, or it can actually mean inheritance by the fields that are defined in that subgraph on that type.
But if we define the location separately everywhere, instead of having a general behavior, then people that use the composite schema specification know that the directives in two locations can mean different things, and then you just have the reference that you. I think this is much easier to understand, right? You see that shareable is definable on the type, but also on the fields. You see that inaccessible is defined on the types, but also on the fields. And then it's just different things. You could also name them differently, but it's the same thing. It's just has a different behavior.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we can simplify it even further. Like the easiest rule would be that you either define, like you have the directive location field, and then you have the directive location type, and that always means the same thing. So it applies to the type as a whole, which is the behavior we want for inaccessible. And I'm wondering if we actually need the sort of inheritance behavior for shareable, or whether we can just say that people need to repeat themselves and specify shareable on every field that is shareable. It's a bit of extra typing, but it is more explicit, and it means that you don't get into situations where, for instance, if you want to make one field accessible, you then have to move things around, or
So maybe
That's what
inaccessible and an accessible type or something like that. So then you have those specific behavior always.
yeah.
I mean, it
I'm
would
wondering,
make shareable much easier to teach.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because the notion of a shareable type is very confusing. And that's how people
shareable is
perceive
like-
it. Yeah.
It's like you accept that, like, I give you permission to like share with me. So it's like the context of the scope of, the access, let's say, it's like local, and inaccessible is like I affect the global space, right? And there are two behaviors, right? I don't want to expose this type, whatever it contains, or I don't want to expose the type, like the fields that are defined, right? And if we have like inaccessible on a type, I don't like this actually in Federation, that you can like make the type inaccessible. But like if you want to make it accessible, but like I would say, like as a Federation developer, like developing with Federation, with Apollo Federation specifically, then if you have inaccessible on the type, I would assume that it, like, first of all, is like locks the type itself across the whole subgraphs, right? And also marks all the fields within the type across the subgraphs as inaccessible, maybe, but I would assume that it's like, just applying to the fields, and then it locks the type. So for me, there are like two behaviors, and those are very ambiguous. And it's like, it will be crazy confusing for people if we like lock the type and then you like unlock the type, let's say, and then everything is like, you know, accessible, which is kind of weird because people would expect that like, yeah, I unlocked it, but you know, maybe like, I don't know. I think like there should be two I would say two, maybe not directives, but like two ways of defining it, which is what Derek suggested, which is like, you know, inaccessible type and inaccessible, which kind of like it's confusing, but like you lock the type or you lock the fields of the type.
It's at least
Well,
consistent and it's safe.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yes. And shareable, I guess it's fine to have on a type, I believe, because it's like, you know.
Well, I mean
It's just a shorthand.
that's the one I was questioning. I was questioning whether
Yeah.
we could get away with removing that because that avoids sort of the two different semantics for directives on
And
type.
it leads also to better schema design, because like if you put it on the type, you don't know if like you accidentally add something, or you add something, but you're not aware that this becomes automatically shareable. Like, because most of the times you anyway don't want to have the whole type shareable, right?
Yeah, it should be an explicit decision to mark a field as shareable.
Well, but so we already have the no externals on types also. I think I can double check, but it's yeah.
I don't think so. Is it?
Yes.
Yeah,
it is.
externals and both. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's like, to me, like shareable and external works kind of the same. So within the subgraph, if you apply it on the type, it's just gonna apply on everything underneath it. Inaccessible is different because that's extra logic there that locks the type, right? So like inaccessible does have two different behaviors. Yes, it propagates it down, but it locks it down as well. With shareable and external, it's kind of like just, it's a single behavior, always applies on all the fields kind of thing. But
Do we need it on the type?
Or external.
It's a shorthand again.
shortcut, it's just a shortcut. Yeah.
Should we get rid of the shortcuts for now and see if we can get away with it? I mean, it like there's no rule against Apollo Federation having the shortcut and other implementations also having it, but like from the like you can always add functionality on top, but from the spec it would be much cleaner if we say like this doesn't exist.
I feel
think
like
that should be fine, but we should clarify that in the spec. Like,
Yeah,
like
it's
the
just
directive locations don't need to match as long as they have this, and then if you want to add extra logic, you can. But yeah,
yeah, no,
I mean, from
in any, like, yeah, go ahead, come in. Sorry,
from the schemas I've seen, it's very common to have shareable on type because of the depth of the type and like nested types and so on. So people just like annotate the shareable on the type and the child type and so on, and then they share the structure, like 2 level deep at least. I mean, the most. But like, and if they have like, and they most of the time they have like a shit ton of fields, then like repeating themselves, shareable is just like too annoying. So the shorthand is actually quite useful, I would say.
What?
Externals, you would generally not have a
Yeah.
external type with 100 fields on it. Shareable, maybe.
What I wonder
yeah,
is,
but there's one thing what we do in also in the core spec, right with the interface. The interfaces by the core spec have to be repeated. And the reason for that is that when you look at the schema and also you check the schema in, for instance, in Git, you see actually the impact that you have. And shareable on the type doesn't tell you about the impact that you have actually. And shareable, if you had it on every field and you add a field or remove this directive, the impact in the diff would be clear. As now, when you just remove it from the type, it's just one place where you remove it, but it has an effect of all the fields where you don't see that in the diff. So it's like from the spec standpoint, we could say that it's better to have the impact clear and don't have the shortcut.
Yeah, I mean, the use case, if you say you have big objects that are shareable, what's the
Use
use
case.
for this? I'm
You
just
know,
I'm honestly just asking the question because even if you have a distributed system, right?
Mhm.
Shouldn't the distributed part be not so dynamic?
It's a
Overlap.
lot of use cases where you have large enterprises where we need namespaces, who need importing, right? It's like you need when people have like these common types that are used for travel. Like we always had this like location object. Like it wasn't an entity, right? It was like the way you describe a location for like a flight, a hotel, etc. Like, and so in that graph, we always had this shareable location, which had like geo coordinates and like these other attributes, and it was like everyone defined it the same way in all these subgraphs. So we made that a shareable type. And the way we managed that is like we had a common definition that like all the subgraph libraries like actually imported a library that had that type. And since we did cogen, it made it easier. But like the only way to make that work in Federation was again, like mark the type as shareable, and then that would just makes it easier to use across all the different subgraphs.
But that would be just, I mean, the location type would just be, I guess, lat long. I mean, there's not much on it, right? I mean, it's not like you have 50 fields on the type that's shareable. I'm not saying that it's
oh,
not. Oh.
You do in some cases for some of these shareable types, they do because maybe they've used them, maybe those bad schemas out, but it doesn't matter. They existed and it grew to that point at large enterprises. So I'm not saying you couldn't use tooling to make that easier. Like you could just then have that common definition, and every type of that common definition has a shareable directive. Like that totally would work. You could make that work. It was just like that's a use case where I'm just telling you there are use cases where people do have shareable types which have lots of fields and they are used.
But when I look from the hot chocolate standpoint, for instance, like we still could have an attribute on the type, but in the schema definition, it would translate into putting it on each of the fields.
Yeah.
Like, isn't it about more about the like implementation for the
I know.
subgraph definition?
Just like code first and schema first, and it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, and like repeating something in code easy, right? But like if
Yeah.
you have to apply it by hand every single time, then it's annoying. But if you have like an object that is shared, then you, like as Shane mentioned, people just use like some kind of like libraries or components that are shared, and they have the SDL with directives, and this is shared, then they do it like once. So for them, it's like annoying, but it's not like, you know, extremely annoying.
It's also just once, yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't worry about that.
Does a field need to be declared on all subgraphs as shareable to not result in a composition error?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you introduce a new field, you
Then
know,
it's-
then you hit a blocker.
Then it's an evolution thing. Then it actually becomes very important. Because if you mark a type as shareable, you can easily add new fields. If you
That's my point.
this, then
But
I see. But then we should have this too, because it's a different behavior actually. Even though it's a shorthand, it's a different behavior, right?
It's
You're
no,
allowed-
it's not. It's still the same of a shorthand. It's just if someone put it on a type over here and someone didn't have the field and someone didn't get like the latest definition of the shared library, if you're doing that method, it's
yeah,
it doesn't make that the evolution
the
any
semantic
easier
is basic.
the other. Yeah.
The semantics-
the
yeah.
inheritance from type to field is local to a subgraph, right?
It's
So
basically copying it, right?
You're right.
Yeah.
When you see it on the type, you copy it down like
Accessible.
to the
This
field.
is not true. It's a cross subgraph.
Yeah.
For
Right,
accessible, it is.
accessible.
Yeah. That's why I was trying to uncouple the two
Yeah, I see.
uses. Yeah.
So to Martin's point, if we were doing the core foundation spec here, like we could start with not having the rule on the type, and that would technically work. And Apollo Federation could have these shorthands, and then if enough people complain that we'd still want the shorthands, like we always add it to the spec and as an addition, right? And extend the capabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, what is the
It's-
feeling
and-
here?
and-
Like what is the general feeling here?
Well, I think from the point of view of like describing the behavior, it's really useful to have it defined explicitly on fields. And even if we want to add the shortcut to the spec, I think that should be a separate rule, sort of like a pre-processing stage. Because then for the validation rule and for the composition behavior, we can just rely on it being defined on the field, because that's what we care about. We care about the attribute being set on the field, so to speak.
Mhm.
Changes the directive definition section though, because there we have the objects in. By the way, Michael, we can make a note. It's the directive locations are wrong in the spec.
Or
Object definition doesn't exist. It's just object. The location object.
yeah. It's a notice object definition, but
I already
I always
that the Apollo Federation documentation is wrong, but actually the composite specification is wrong.
no. It's because in the node is called object definition node, but the location is called object.
Yeah, just to say. So that would change the definition of the directive, right? Because shareable would then no longer be valid on object. It would only be valid on fields. Yeah. But I think we should, let's make it as usual. Let's start strict and then loosen it up. Right.
Yeah, I mean, if we define this the algorithms like we just discussed, basically for these directives, we even have a pre-processing step, so that takes each subgraph and deletes basically that from the type definition and copies it to the fields. And then in the merging algorithm and so forth, we only look at the field level. It's easy to describe.
Yeah.
So one comment though is that we probably will need to define the composability rules when those definitions across subgraphs will differ, right? So if you evolve the directive definition and one says, I have my, the shareable on type and on object and the field, right? And the other one says, I only have it on the field. They should still compose into single one. So basically they're still compatible with each other, right? That's what we do with, right now with the Apollo Federation, that we accept those because subgraphs may define their, well, in order to have a valid graph, they should define that, right?
You mean
use
like
the shorthands for the library to provide you that, but in order to have a valid running graph, you should have those definitions, right?
Yeah, but like the what I meant is like we can keep them like this, like if we all agree that this is actually a useful shortcut, we just keep it like it is, like it's also in Apollo Federation now. But we define the algorithms explicit and say basically they will be in a pre-processing for the subgraphs. We remove them from the type and copy them to the field. And that's the behavior. And we would also define, I don't know if we have to define it here. Oh yeah, we will point it out. Maybe a reference.
Maybe
to
we can come up with a nice name for this behavior, and then just like point to it for the directives that it applies to, like spreading behavior or something, or inheritance, or I don't know what the useful term would be.
Because we have it in 2, and this is then it's consistent the same thing. Maybe there in the future comes another one that has some kind of this copy behavior, but so for inaccessible we need it like it is.
Well, there's 3 of them have that behavior, but inaccessible has extra behavior on the type, right?
Yes, it really has semantics. So it is basically about intent. I intend to make this type inaccessible across the subgraph. So I can maybe introduce it first
But it's a different flavor of directive in general. It's not only this part of the directive, it's a completely different flavor of directive. Inaccessible
Yeah.
always changes all the different other subgraphs.
So are we all in favor to have like a separate inaccessible on the types to actually simplify this behavior? So we have inaccessible that's on the fields, and then you have an extra one that's specifically for the types.
No, I
to
don't
make sure that-
think
no?
that's what we discussed, right? Or
No,
did I
yeah,
miss-
it was like there was we had this suggestion, but I also like think it like we can describe the behavior actually fine, because like you can say you can make types inaccessible. It's easier to describe this behavior than actually this copy behavior, right? There we have to
Yeah.
do an extra step to describe it. But in this case, like it's inaccessible, the type is inaccessible, or the fields are inaccessible. And
But for both type and field locations, the behavior of inaccessible, as Pascal pointed out, I think is different from the other directives, because even for fields, like marking it as inaccessible in one subgraph marks it as inaccessible in all subgraphs.
yes,
So
yes.
maybe we should sort of differentiate between those flavors of directives. Maybe they're like, I don't know, supergraph level directives or subgraph level directives or something, or pre-compose and post-compose directives. I don't know what like useful terminology would be, but there is a semantic difference.
The semantic difference does show up in the supergraph too, right? Like at inaccessible, I know we don't talk about this supergraph file here, but like at inaccessible actually goes and appears in the supergraph schema.
Yeah.
Whereas at shareable doesn't actually appear in the supergraph schema. It gets compiled out into, well, you're just the type is defined as joined across many subgraphs. Like you never see at shareable in the supergraph, but you do see at inaccessible in the supergraph. So
Yeah.
that's like the literal semantic difference.
Yeah, so maybe point out the difference between like supergraph directives and subgraph directives or something. Maybe that's more confusing than
we have to
helpful,
find,
but
like, is it
yeah.
just for inaccessible that this is true?
No, I think key is also, well, it's treated a little differently, but it does appear on the supergraph.
Yeah, it's a different directive name, but it technically is there in some capacity.
Well, but the
Yes.
keys is still, well, it's propagated out, right? So the subgraph has to define the key for it to be there, right? When they
Yeah.
can have different keys, right?
Yeah.
So it's not exactly the same. I
Yeah,
would say
let's first
I think
describe
the-
it here per directive, and then
Yeah.
see if we can infer from it like types.
So we do have other directives that behave like that, but we're not talking about them right now. So and other directives like inaccessible are the ones that we added for like demand control and
Demand control.
yeah,
I know. Yeah, like
authorization.
load stuff
Yeah,
and
like
yeah.
authorized, right, and all that stuff, or like cost directive, right, from IBM spec. Those have a similar behavior that they get propagated to the supergraph, but that's we're not talking about this right now.
Yeah, I think these are in general out of scope. That's where these are enterprise service directives.
I'm just
should be-
mentioning that there are other
yeah.
cases where this gets propagated out.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it is useful to keep them in mind as we think about sort of these categories of directives, even if we don't include them in here.
Yeah. How do you do this with cost? Because cost is different. Like you could have different cost on subgraphs, right? This subgraph, the same field could here be more expensive than here. So you would have multiple costs on the supergraph.
Logic there, but
I
I think there's some logic to determine, but it's not. I think the cost is actually it's a supergraph value. It's not per subgraph value. So there's
Because
still...
like we built it into Hot Chocolate Infusion to do query planning, basically on cost. And you have to like it's not like inaccessible, right? You have to know the costs on each of the subgraphs because
it's a different use case though, because I think for demand control we don't actually look at the query plan. Like we don't look at where a certain field comes from in a particular case. We compute the overall cost for a query.
Okay.
Not
Okay.
yet.
But yeah.
Not yet. Yeah.
Okay. But let's first define it into the directive section, and then see like how we distill from that the general kind of directive. I would say it's always easier to describe the particular case and then abstract it. Awesome. Oh, and we are at time, but that was good. Like actually, that led to a very good discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, I have the notes. If I can post them roughly, it's into our Slack channel for interested, and then we're gonna work through them, and then next week look at where we are with these.
Yeah, that's good.
Awesome. See you next week.
All right. See you next week.
Bye.